Sometime around 2016, I started deconstructing my faith. I created a group called Karl's Coaching because I thought, well, since I was a pastor, I must need to be a coach now. But I abandoned that idea and created the Desert Sanctuary with my wife, Laura. Shortly thereafter, I started writing down my experiences, which eventually became books. Later on, Laura would join me, and I would also write some fiction books. Apparent Faith was my first attempt at recording what I was going through. It used the lens of parenthood to try to understand how I was feeling about God and how those views were changing. I also had an experience in a tea shop while visiting my son that literally changed my life. After a scooter wreck altered our plans, I ended up in this tea house where I met the man with no name. As I began to grow and heal, as some describe it, was like peeling back layers of an onion, and eventually I had what I would consider my dark night of the soul, where all of my past things that I tried to stuff down came up, and being is my journey towards presence and authenticity and healing. When I discovered a hotel in my hometown that had many rumors of tunnels under the street and prohibition and gangsters and goblins and ghosts, I decided to write a fiction novel loosely based on this hotel. It's history with a mystery. When Laura joined me on our best book, it became the best-selling title we have so far. It's an honest evaluation of organized religion in the 21st century, and is it possible to thrive outside of organized religion? The second novel begins with the idea of a woman who was pregnant in high school and got trapped in a small town, who later becomes the hero of the story. Lots of twists and turns to this novel, but Jenny is the hero in the end. Leaning forward is the idea that came from my childhood, where we were always discovering. It's a continuation of Out into the Desert, with stories from our podcast and our experiences out here in the desert since we started our deconstruction. We also had the privilege of contributing to a book called Parenting Deconstruction, which is 10 or 12 authors with different perspectives on how they handle different aspects of parenting out in the desert. We hope that you will eventually try all of our books, but pick out the one that's right for you and ask us if you need some help. Also, if you can't afford a book, please let us know because we'd like to help you out. As always, be where you are, be who you are, and be at peace.
I am Megan Benninger. I'm a cult survivor, a whistleblower, a church abuse advocate, a mother of 5 children, and I've been married 27 years to my husband, Dom. And Dom and I have co-founded the BaptistAccountability.org website, where we track Baptist abusers and enablers in mainly Baptist churches and institutions. Purity culture is a Christian subculture of abstinence-only education. It teaches that there is to be no sex before marriage. Sometimes even kissing is forbidden. Dating is discouraged because that could lead to sex. Many portions of purity culture even encouraged courtship model, where basically the father and the man involved made the deal, and the girl was like maybe happy about it, but maybe not. And women and girls in this worldview are seen as responsible for men and boys' desires and behaviors, and they're encouraged to dress modestly in order to not arouse these sexual urges in men and boys. And they're really just made the fall guy. Purity culture often fails also to teach about basic biology and consent. And it does not educate about birth control methods because they think that it will lead to increased rates of premarital sex and sexually transmitted diseases. But that's an absolutely unfounded belief. Many studies now have shown that purity culture had zero effect on preventing unwanted pregnancy or sexually transmitted diseases. And it's also interesting to note that evangelical Christian purity culture has had a significant influence in our federal government. As the Christian right rose, they had an influence, and it ended up that abstinence-only education was then widely implemented in public schools. So, and sometimes you can think of purity culture as similar to rape culture, what people talk about in more secular circles. I listened to one interesting scholar, and she said that purity culture and rape culture are incestuous lovers. I thought that was really interesting. But purity culture is the term in religious circles that we tend to use when talking about this. So in my talk today, I'm basically going to be sharing my own experience. And I want to make very clear that I'm not a therapist. I'm not a professional. I don't have any certifications in this field. I'm not speaking as an expert. I am just sharing my personal experience and hoping that it might resonate with some people or be helpful in some way. Just some of the things I've found helpful in reclaiming married sex and my own body from purity culture. And again, if you don't resonate with my personal experience, I right away want to recommend Linda K. Klein's book, Pure, for an in-depth study of purity culture. And she includes a wide range of diverse testimonials on this topic, with LGBTQ people, single people, married people. If you don't resonate with my experience, guaranteed you will find something in there to resonate with, and it is a brilliant book on the topic. So my introduction to purity culture, I believe I was just marinated in it growing up. I went to a very fundamentalist Christian school from pre-K through 12th grade, the whole way through. And this school was very legalistic. Girls had to wear skirts below the knees. We had to wear long shorts under our skirts. I remember being sent home one day for my skirt being too short. And the test they would do is you would kneel to the ground. And if your skirt didn't touch the ground, you had to go home because it was unacceptable unless you had something at school to change into. So very strict modesty rules. We also had a 6-inch rule, and I'm not sure that this was technically a rule or if it was a mythology, but I think it might have been an actual rule in my early years, but people always referred to it. And boys and girls basically weren't supposed to get too close, weren't supposed to sit beside each other, be alone together, things like that. And no dancing. And even things like when we went on field trips, you certainly couldn't sit on the bus seat together. And just really legalistic things. Like we couldn't stop at restaurants that served alcohol. I mean, I know that doesn't have to do with purity, but just to give you an idea of the school. So that school, Heritage Academy, not surprisingly, has been in the news recently for covering up child physical and sexual abuse for over 40 years. And my junior high and high school history teacher, Robert Becker, has been convicted now a little over a year ago for child sex abuse. And he is now in prison for 5 years, which is pathetic when you think about it, because people who do marijuana get longer sentences than that. And it's really just terrible. But if you've really been paying any attention to religious news, this is a pattern that we're now seeing in a lot of schools and churches, institutions that teach purity culture. They're living like the absolute opposite of that, and abuse is rampant. So I also had some influence from my church, which was the Grace Brethren denomination. And a lot of people aren't familiar with that, but it's very close to Baptist. And we had a Wednesday night girls group in that church that was called SMM. And so SMM stood for Serving My Master. And it was similar to Girl Scouts, except that we earned badges for things like sewing, baking, reading your Bible all the way through, memorizing scripture, all the things that would groom us to be submissive and obedient wives and church members. And in the picture that Laura just shared, this was a ceremony of the entire area. All the SMM groups would get together and have this ceremony where the girls were recognized for their badges. And whoever earned the most badges that year would be crowned princess. And we wore white dresses mostly and carried flowers down an aisle, as you can see. And please take note of the men looking at me and their expressions. I think sometimes pictures really do speak 1,000 words. So I was never involved in purity bowls or purity rings. That came a little bit later. So I was kind of before that time, but the messages were still loud and clear. And I don't remember hearing purity culture laid out officially until my senior year of high school. So even though these messages were constant, I was pretty rebellious. And I did experiment sexually as a teen, but I felt great shame about this. And I believed that staying pure was the right thing to do. I just wasn't doing it and didn't want to do it. And it was like this great war in my mind and body of, knowing what's supposed to be right, but not doing it. But also not questioning. I mean, I was indoctrinated and this was all I knew. And I was talking about this with Dom and he said, it sounds like it was biology versus theology. I said, yeah, that's a pretty good way to put it. So because I was taught this nonstop from birth, I lived in shame. I was also convinced that I had to marry my boyfriend that I had been sexually active with. Because, if you had sex with someone, that was it. You were theirs. Otherwise, you were used up, useless for anyone else. So when he broke up with me, and by the way, he went to public school, so he didn't have any of these hang-ups at all. And that was, looking back, I was so unaware of what was going on. But looking back, I can see how interesting that was. That he didn't feel any of that guilt or shame. And here I was just utterly devastated, no idea what to do next because I was so ruined for any other man. And so my shame just grew exponentially. And then 1 year later, so he had broken up with me the summer before my senior year. And at the end of my senior year, my class at Heritage Academy took a week-long senior trip to Word of Life Institute in New York. And the theme of our entire week there was purity. And it's really interesting because I didn't realize this until I was preparing for this talk. And I was doing research just to see where I lined up in the whole purity culture thing. And here it turns out that it seems that the beginning of organized purity culture was basically when True Love Waits started. And True Love Waits is an international Christian group that promotes sexual abstinence outside of marriage for teenagers and college students. TLW was created in April 1993 by the Southern Baptists and is sponsored by Lifeway Christian Resources. And again, if you know anything about what's happening in the Southern Baptist denomination, it's just rampant with abuse. So they started this organization in April of 1993. My senior trip was May of 1993, possibly June, but probably May. And so I didn't realize this connection. And I looked up, I happened to be able to remember the speaker's name after all these years, Ron Hutchcraft. And I looked him up, and sure enough, he was connected with the True Love Waits movement. So I thought that was really interesting. To give a little further context to the purity timeline, most people are more familiar with Josh Harris's I Kissed Dating Goodbye book. And that didn't arrive on the scene until 1997. And I was married by 1996. So I was really only experiencing the earliest part of purity culture before I got married. So back to this week-long trip at Word of Life Institute. Ron Hutchcraft's sermons really impacted me. And I remember that he compared having premarital sex to opening your Christmas presents before Christmas morning. And he really painted a picture of just how dreadful it would be to spoil the surprise and have nothing to look forward to. And I'm sure he used many other analogies, but that, for some reason, is the one I remember and sticks in my head. So by this point, I had already been called a chewed up piece of gum by a boy that I had a crush on that year, who found out that I had already been tampered with by another male. And so now, after a week of concentrated purity messages, my self-esteem was in the toilet. But I was inspired, and I resolved to do better. I did not, in fact, do better by the definition that they were giving of better. Shame doing what shame does, I did worse. I felt it didn't matter anymore because I'd ruined myself. So why bother? I wasn't by any means wildly promiscuous, but by the time I met my husband-to-be Dom, I certainly was far outside of the bounds of the ideal for purity culture standards. I was a petaless rose, a prematurely unwrapped gift, a chewed up flavorless stick of gum, which, all of these analogies that had been used really turned women into objects and objectified them and dehumanized us as if, we were something that could be used up. Early on in my dating relationship with Dom, we had met in college, and I felt it was necessary to tell him that I was not a virgin because he was a Christian, probably looking for, a Christian pure wife, a virgin. So when I told him that I was not a virgin, it really stopped him in his tracks. He had saved himself, and I was sure this was going to be a deal breaker, and I deserved it, right? I mean, I had done this, and there was no going back. I was ruined. And boy, this time period was just really rough as he was, taking time to think through, did he even want to continue this relationship? And thankfully, he decided he did want to. and that he could forgive and, hopefully get past the resentment. But you can imagine that I felt worse than ever about my failings. And so we continued dating. And by the way, I just want to make clear that I do have Dom's permission to share anything I say here. I have run by him. I have actually read through this with him and have his permission to share anything I share, and he agrees with. So while we were dating, we struggled not to go all the way, and we made it until we were engaged, which was something, I guess. We couldn't wait to be married, and even a few months before our wedding was scheduled, we considered eloping very strongly because we didn't want to live in sin, and we just couldn't wait another second. But alas, we did wait for the ceremony. Well, we didn't wait, but we did wait and didn't elope. So marriage felt like a huge relief. Like there was going to be no more guilt, but of course there still was all the guilt from the past, but no more, we weren't going to be adding to that. We weren't going to be sinning anymore. It was going to be great. And literally on our honeymoon, it wasn't great. At least once. So our wedding night, and I'm wondering how many people can relate to this, I was just so utterly exhausted from the day. I had no desire to do anything, but I felt like you have to consummate your wedding night, right? So I pushed myself, no big deal. But little did I know that this would actually be the first of many times throughout marriage that I would give in to having sex when I really just didn't want to. I was too tired, too whatever. And because it was the right and godly thing to do, to always be available for your husband, right? I mean, that's what I had been taught. So it was really interesting to me that purity culture didn't end when marriage started. It just kind of morphed into this new thing. And one of the books that I read as a new wife was called The Total Woman by Maribel Morgan. And this book was actually written in 1973, I believe. And I was much after that now. It was 1996-ish. But I got a hold of a copy of that book and read it and loved it. I mean, it reinforced everything I had already learned, but now it was how to be a good wife, now that you're there. And this book, by the way, is discussed in Kristen Dumais' Jesus and John Wayne. She goes into this book and how it influenced purity culture and just the culture of our nation in general. So Maribel Morgan made what seemed like fun suggestions to seduce your husband, to keep him faithful. So that was, after all, my duty now. One of her suggestions was to meet your husband at the door in saran wrap. Do all these cute things. Your whole day was to be ordered around making your husband as happy and comfortable as possible once he got home from work. And it was my duty to keep my husband so wildly sexually satisfied that he would never even consider looking at another woman. But he inevitably would look at other women because men are uncontrollable and insatiable in their sexual desires. So it was this catch-22, like you just couldn't win, but you were supposed to try. So she also set forth very clearly defined roles that supposedly scripture laid out for women. Spoiler alert, I learned later these were not so clearly laid out as people were saying. Complementarianism wasn't a word I was familiar with back then, but it is now that I understand what that is, that that describes how we were indoctrinated to see marriage. And to define complementarianism simply, the husband is to be the head of the wife, as Christ was the head of the church. And the wife was to be the helpmeet and was there to make the husband successful and happy. And these were the messages in every single Christian marriage book, marriage sermon, everything having to do with Christian marriage that I ever heard for decades. This was echoed in the Bill Gothard seminar that Dom and I went to early in our marriage. I also subscribed to the Above Rubies magazine, which, if anyone's familiar with the Quiverful movement, that magazine puts forth that worldview, which is that women are to have as many children as God will let them have, no birth control, basically building the kingdom for Christ by breeding. And a friend from church had also given me a book about Quiverful, and I have a really intense memory of reading through that book. And I came to a part where it said that birth control could end a pregnancy if it didn't work right and you got pregnant, which apparently they're saying many women did, and it was just aborting the baby. And I was mortified when I found that out, because I was on the pill. And I ran to Dom. He was out working in our garage, and I just sobbed and sobbed, sure that I had just killed numerous babies already. And I cannot tell you how deeply this affected me. I felt like I had committed the worst crime on the planet without even realizing it. And so the shame grew. I never took another birth control pill after that day. And I soon became pregnant with our first child. I didn't have the internet back then to check out the truth of these claims. And I don't regret having any of my children in any way now. I love them all dearly and so glad I had them. But I very much regret listening to these unscientific claims and hating myself so completely as a result. So years later, we were pregnant with our fifth child, and we were at a Southern Baptist church by this point, and they were holding a baby shower for us. And it was a big to-do because there was another woman having a baby too. It was a combined shower, big crowd. And it was happening. There were tables set up in the sanctuary, and, the pastors and deacons, whoever was speaking, could still be up on the stage. And we were jokingly praised from the pulpit for building the kingdom. But it wasn't a joke, because I remember in that very church being shown statistics about Muslims versus Christians and the populations of those, as if it were a cosmic competition for world domination. And I don't remember it being at that church specifically, but I remember very much hearing from pulpits being encouraged to outbreed other religions, which just is sick to me now. I mean, it's just sick. After our first few years of marriage went on, so I'm backtracking a bit now, another thing that happened was my aunt bought us a whole cassette tape series on marriage. And this is another one. I don't remember the title of it. If anyone happens to know of a marriage course that was put out in the late 90s, let me know. I want to say it was by Tim LaHaye, but I'm not sure that's correct. But anyway, it reinforced all the things we had already learned. But one new suggestion it added was scheduling sex. And this was supposedly to help the man stay satisfied so he could function properly. And this would supposedly allow the woman to mentally prepare herself for the act and put on her best everything for the occasion. And somehow this was supposed to build intimacy and make the marriage relationship stronger. But you might see how these ways of thinking could strip sex of any beauty or spontaneity or expression of love. And sex was solidly framed now as an obligation on my part and an entitlement on Dom's part. And if it didn't happen as scheduled, Dom felt rejected and cranky, and I felt like a failure. And this dynamic played out over decades and really did a number on our sex life. And I don't want to imply that we never had any good times. We certainly had wonderful, beautiful times and a pretty darn good relationship considering the system we were in. We did really well in spite of our circumstances, but this was a thread that just kept making things worse and killing my desire for anything. So things gradually got worse instead of better, and neither of us were happy with things, though we were supposedly doing things the best way, God's way. We went on, as I said, to have 5 children. I delivered them all by C-section, and I had no concept of physical trauma either, or that this much birthing might be hard on my body, because I'd been taught that literally female bodies were designed and created for this purpose. And God would decide when I was finished. He would either close my womb or cause me to start, menopause or whatever. So we didn't see that all the way through. We did, by the way, I ended up having my tubes tied after the 5th baby, but I mourned over that. Like I did feel like I was doing something very wrong. So again, I didn't always live by the things that I believed and was taught. And that caused even more internal, problems, psychological problems. There was also no room in my mind to allow myself space to heal after these births beyond the 6-week recovery recommendation given by my doctor. Dom was never pushy about getting back to getting busy. He never pushed, but I pushed myself because I thought it was the right thing to do. It would almost appear that I was my own oppressor, that I was trained so well. I became my own slave master, my own abuser. But really looking back, I can see now that I was doing the best that I could to survive in a system where I felt I had no choice. So I'm trying to have compassion for myself now. And another memory that is burned in my brain that I wanted to share happened shortly after one of my children was born. And there was a mother of many in my circle of friends who I admired greatly. Everyone admired her and thought of her as a mentor, the type of biblical woman that you aspire to be. And so when I needed help, I went to her for advice. And I had just had a baby and my 6 weeks of recovery was up. And I was doing my duty, but I was struggling so badly. I was just so worn out physically and emotionally, and I had no desire to have sex. In fact, I wanted desperately not to have sex at this point, and asked her, what should I do? And her advice was basically that we need to suck it up for our men. Their need is so great. And she herself had to grit her teeth to get through it at times. But this is what is necessary, and switch it to morning if you need to so that you have more energy. Things like that. So I felt really disappointed after that meeting, but also somewhat fortified to do what needed to be done for God, right? So all these good intentions on the part of Dom and me we kept hurting each other. We didn't know what to do. So we kept plugging along, trying the same things over and over because it's all we'd ever been taught. Why wasn't God's way working? Looking back, without therapy, I didn't have the skills to unwind what was happening. It's only in retrospect now that I can even tell this story, seeing more clearly what was happening. And I titled this talk, Reclaiming Married Sex from Purity Culture, because that has been what I consider my journey to be up to this point. Even being able to tell this story now, is an act of reclamation for me. And I really appreciate all of you who are here to listen. So finally, about 5 years ago, maybe 6, I'm really bad with time, and not too long ago, came a breaking point of all things in our shared life. We had several huge catastrophes all at once. First, Dom and I discovered that one of our pastors, the one who had a great relationship with our kids and who had baptized our oldest 2 children, was a convicted child molester. And our Southern Baptist church that we were in had covered this up basically for 12 years. And our children had been in danger all that time. I won't take time to get into the details of that story because it is told in USA Today. You can search it. It is called The Tongue is a Fire. If you search that with my name, Megan Benninger, it'll come right up. I'll also provide the link in my resource list. But basically, we became whistleblowers and suffered all the consequences that come along with that role. So at the same time as the whistleblowing, I was also having a major health crisis. I was basically having early Alzheimer's symptoms. I'd had physical symptoms for many years, but doctors just kept telling me your blood work's fine, everything's fine. And I knew I wasn't fine, but I was at a breaking point now because I was literally getting lost driving familiar places. I was seeing things move that weren't moving. My brain was not working. I was so forgetful. And I even on occasion had false memories, like remembered things that didn't happen, which was really bizarre. So I was to a point where I couldn't ignore it anymore, and I had to figure out what was happening. So I ultimately, long story short, got diagnosed with late-stage neurological Lyme disease. And I started a grueling 8-month treatment that left me mostly bedridden. And I can see now how a lot of my symptoms could also have been trauma, and how hard it is to unwind that. And many people will talk about that, the relationship of chronic illness with trauma and abuse. And it really just did a number on me. Meanwhile, our support system, our church, was suddenly gone. We were being shunned, defamed, harassed, intimidated, doxxed. We had our personal information published on Twitter. All the things that I used to think only happened to people leaving cults like Scientology or maybe the mafia, but not a small town Baptist church. It was just crazy. And dark night of the soul feels like an understatement for this time period. I was having a complete breakdown physically, mentally, and spiritually. I had had a lot of trauma, spiritual trauma over the years, and not just in my church and school growing up, but then Dom and I were also involved in a cult for 3 years during college and the first year of our marriage, which I won't get into today, but a lot of spiritual trauma there. We went on to other abusive churches in various denominations. We tried charismatic. We, went back to Southern Baptist. It was everywhere, the spiritual abuse. So even though I'd gone through all these, I really took to heart, when people said, this wasn't God doing this to you. This was just people. And so I refused to give up. I let that spiritual trauma just drive me deeper into my Christian faith, always trying harder, trusting Jesus more. And so even after this whistleblowing incident and the betrayal of a church cover-up and having my children put in danger, even after having this complete breakdown on all levels, I did not give up yet. We found a new church. But I was having major trauma responses. I was wailing during the services, having to run out of the sanctuary, bawling. It was just horrible. And it would take me days to recover and then start the whole thing over again the next Sunday. And church really was only one of the only outings I would do during the week because I was so sick. And so I will say the one silver lining to this whole breakdown was that I finally went to try professional licensed therapy as opposed to church counselors. And I got my foot in the door because the therapist I went to specialized in chronic illness. And that somehow felt slightly more okay than maybe going for some other reason. Of course, I had been indoctrinated. It was wrong to seek any worldly pop psychology, help outside of God's word. Psychology was sinful and to be avoided at all costs, and Christ was sufficient, supposedly. My therapist really was a lifesaver, and she was the one who finally recommended that I take a break from the church. And she said that I wouldn't heal if I kept re-traumatizing myself week after week. Soon after she had said this, I was sharing with Dom just how much therapy was helping me and how it was nothing like I thought it was going to be, from all the negative press I had been given about it. And so Dom also started going to a therapist, not just regular therapy at this point. And his therapist gave him similar advisement. And his quote from his therapist was, "You can't heal from a burn while continuing to play in the fire." So at this point, we're both taking a break. I desperately wanted to heal for my children. And so I was willing to do whatever it took at that point. I thought, well, if I'm stopping church, I might as well stop anything having to do with my faith, because it all triggers me now. Praying, listening to sermons, listening to worship music, like all of that just made me sick. So I stopped everything. And this, I thought, was going to be temporary. But I really noticed a shift at the 3-month mark about and the 6-month mark. Like by 6 months, I just felt like a totally different person. Like my thinking had changed so much. And when I look back on that, the silencing of all the Christian faith messages, I think that what happened is that I deprogrammed from years of constant indoctrination. And my worldview simply did not hold together without the constant programming, teaching, music, lyrics, books, etc. And this was the beginning of my personal deconstruction journey. Took another year or so for Dom and I to realize that our deconstruction journey, which he began deconstructing also, which I am eternally grateful for, because I know that doesn't always happen in marriage. But we realized that this deconstruction extended to our sex life. We had started reading a lot, like the book Pure, and learning about the ills of purity culture and how that, was working out for people, and began to see that it was affecting us. But even after having this cognitive understanding, nothing was getting better. So we realized we needed help. So there are two major ways that I have worked to reclaim both married sex and just my personal body, my autonomy, that I want to share. The first was deconstructing the actual theology and underlying beliefs of purity culture more, which is important. It is very important to understand where it went wrong. But then also, what do you do after that? And so the other thing we did was seek out sex therapy, professional sex therapy, and learn to build a new personal sex ethic. So first, I'm just going to discuss briefly unwinding the theology a little bit more, because it is an important part, though it didn't change anything in and of itself. It is important to understand it cognitively, I think, too, for things to start changing. I began to see the problems that were stemming from the supposed biblical worldview of sex and marriage. I discovered egalitarianism, which is kind of the alternative to complementarianism. It's a philosophy where males and females are viewed as having equal power and authority, not having predetermined binary gender roles. And I discovered that some denominations and brands of Christianity had held the view of egalitarianism for a very long time, and they could defend it scripturally well. And they even allowed women to be pastors. I dove into the writings of a few people I'll list, and I'll provide these if anyone is interested. Marg Malczko. I read Beth Allison Barr's The Making of Biblical Womanhood. I joined a Facebook group that was helpful called Biblical Christian Egalitarians. It was very liberating to see that people could interpret scripture so differently and be as convinced of their doctrine as my camp had been about ours. But that was just the beginning. So I marinated there in the egalitarian Christian world for quite a while. I don't know time frame, maybe a year or so. In general, I was thinking I could save my Christian faith at that point if I found the right theologies. But as time went on, I ran into biblical scholarship, which is a whole different wing of things. And I started following people like Pete Enns, Bart Ehrman, more recently, Dr. Jennifer Bird, who really were pointing out that the Bible isn't anything like what we taught it was. The way it was written, who it was written by, we have been dreadfully misinformed by pastors. And some of them don't know it, I think, but I think some of them do and just don't want to lose their jobs, because apparently this stuff is taught in seminaries, many seminaries, maybe not the most conservative ones, but just learning about the Bible in general changed so much. And these people also seem to be saying that when you're looking at the time period of the Bible, both Old and New Testament, Hebrew Bible and New Testament, even in its most progressive parts, it was still patriarchal and women were still property. Yes, even in the New Testament. And so, and that it was important to be honest about that. And that doesn't fit real tidily with a view of inerrancy of scripture. So I started unwinding all of that. And basically, to get into a little what Dr. Jennifer Bird, by the way, I've only discovered her recently, and I have just learned so much from her. And I'm going to link a few of her things, but she just points out so much that marriage in the Bible was about women being property. There was no concept of a relationship beyond sex and ownership, and sex was how a man basically marked his territory and showed ownership of a woman. So it wasn't this beautiful, romantic, mutual love that we think of now when we think of marriage. And it's really not okay to read that into the scripture, because it is not what they were talking about. And woman's consent wasn't even necessary for a marriage to take place. And men were often married to multiple wives and had access to those wives, slaves for sex. There was no purity teachings for men whatsoever, only for the women. And even then, it wasn't really spelled out beyond no sex. A man took or bought a wife, and a father gave or sold a daughter. It was a transaction of property. So again, I will link to her info, and she has a new book coming out called Marriage in the Bible, What Do the Texts Say? And I'm telling you, just the interviews I've watched of her, mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing. So in conjunction with studying and unwinding the theology of purity culture, we also sought out specialized help, began seeing a licensed sex therapist. And surely a sex therapist could tell us how to fix everything. So 3 years later, sometimes we're like, have we made any progress? Some days it feels like that. We definitely have, but it is not a quick fix like most things. These beliefs are so much deeper than I could have ever imagined. And we are totally still in the trenches and mid-process, like just, So I'm not here to necessarily teach you anything today. Just tell you, our experience, what has been helpful. And as we went to this sex therapist, I think we were both really hopeful that she was going to lay out the new sex ethic for us. Like, yeah, it would be liberal, but there would be this whole new way of doing things. And we knew what we'd been doing was harmful. We knew what not to do, but no idea what we were to do. So what was the right way to go about this now? As if, there were two options and she was going to tell us the other one. What we were confronted with, though, was a journey where there were no clearly defined rules. We've been encouraged to look at the research and evidence of how things actually affect people sexually and consider our own values and make a new plan together. I discovered that I had a lot of trauma, some caused merely by the messages I'd been given my whole life, and dealing with shame is one of the hardest parts of the process. And some of my healing has been taking long breaks from sex altogether. And thankfully, Dom has been very understanding and given me all the space that I need. Not that it's been perfect or easy by any means, but he acknowledges that he was the person that benefited most from the system that we were in. And certainly it harmed him too, but he was also benefiting from it. And he can admit that and has given me permission to share that and might be sharing more on his own at some point too. And so now sometimes I just needed the rest that I didn't give myself. So our sex therapist has literally had me look Dom in the eye and say repeatedly, I am not responsible for your pleasure. And that is so hard because that is the opposite of what I was taught, that this was my responsibility. But my body needs to feel safe again, like sex is something to be desired and enjoyed, not just expected. And so this is what it's taking on occasion, some of these really hard things. Another main theme in our sex therapy has been finding our own sexuality apart from each other, which we never had, really an opportunity to do outside of purity culture teachings. So one thing she recommended is masturbation. And I don't love that word because I think it has so much baggage. She introduced us to a new term, self-pleasure, which I prefer to use. And that is an issue that has been completely demonized by evangelical Christianity and purity culture. And there's literally nothing about it in the Bible. There's one story about Onan in the Old Testament who was supposed to impregnate his dead brother's wife so they could carry on the lineage, but he pulled out before the sex act was over and spilled his seed on the ground and God struck him dead. So that was supposed to be proof that somehow masturbation was wrong because you'd be wasting semen as if it, was in being rationed somehow and couldn't be replaced. Oh my. And so obviously they didn't understand biology back then, but that was not referring to self-pleasure anyway. And self-pleasure has been an important tool in getting to know our bodies and reclaiming our bodies. Christianity in general, I think, certainly purity culture has a way of disembodying us, making us dissociate from ourselves, especially when we're repressing sexuality constantly. And we're enduring. For a woman, maybe enduring sex, you dissociate sometimes just to get through it. So it has been an important practice for us to reclaim our bodies. And it can also, we found out, be therapeutic for a person with lower desire. It can help build desire. It can be therapeutic for a person who has super high desire and maybe their partner has low desire, so that they can be self-sufficient sometimes with their needs if their partner isn't always available or in the mood. And I know porn is a big issue. I don't have time to get into that today, but it is something that we have delved into a bit not just the philosophy behind it, but that some couples do incorporate that. And if it is an ethical source, which our sex therapist assures us exists, I still am back and forth on that one, but some couples do choose to implement that. But she also let us know that porn isn't what we think it is, always visual. Like people always think of video porn, but really, steamy novels can be porn, or there's audio porn, or, different things like that you don't always think about. So she basically, though, has talked through our ideas about sex that we had and where those came from, how those line up with the researched evidence, maybe giving us options of things we may never have considered, and never pushing us towards, doing anything, but saying, here's something you can try that's, some people find helpful. And she's given us a lot of different exercises to explore intimacy, even apart from sex, like just at different levels of interaction. So I think coming to the end now, I think I'm very fortunate to be in the situation I'm in where my partner is willing to work with me and we're unwinding this together. And I just want to acknowledge this is just my experience. And I know that there are many women out there and men who their partner is not on the same journey. And I can't even imagine that. And that's a whole different story that I think a therapist helps people unwind these types of things. I know a lot of people do end up separating because, again, it's really hard to heal if you're in an environment where you're constantly being harmed. And that's really just a difficult situation. So I just recommend for anyone on either side, if your partner is in with you, if they're not, seeking out a professional therapist. Maybe even one with religious trauma expertise. And I'm going to provide a few links in my resources. Reclamationcollective.com is a great place to find therapists who have religious trauma experience. And I'm also going to provide another link. I can't remember the name offhand, but it's a search engine specifically for licensed sex therapists, and it covers the whole country. And I do want to say here that if you think you may be in an abusive relationship and you decide to seek out therapy, it would be best to go alone first without a partner. Abusive people are very skilled at fooling even therapists, and you will be able to speak more freely about your side of the story and unwind what's happening without that person being there. And this is just advice usually given by abuse advocates. So it's a really tricky thing sometimes for people to unwind if they're being abused or not, especially when they're in an abusive system. So like in my case, Dom wasn't trying to gain power over me, but he thought that being this person was what he was supposed to do. I don't know if that makes sense. It can be really hard to unwind if it's deliberate or not. If you feel safe with your partner, definitely it would be great to seek out couples therapy or sex therapy together. That's a great way to go. But like I said, much of my personal journey has involved Dom taking a step back and giving some things up. So you have to kind of weigh if is your partner willing to do that? And while he was never abusive intentionally, like my body experienced these expectations as abuse. And again, I wouldn't have defined it as such, but the outcomes of our behaviors are often different than our intentions. So I want to say here again, some partners do intend to abuse. They are deliberate and calculated and excellent at hiding their motives. So do some research, possibly if you're not sure, on narcissistic abuse or coercive control. Another great thing to research is the National Domestic Hotline, which I believe their website is hotline.org. I will put that in the resources. But they have a menu item called Identifying Abuse. that goes through all the different kinds of abuse, not just physical, also emotional, financial, can be helpful for unwinding. A lot of people just really aren't sure what kind of a situation they're in because purity culture itself is abusive. I would go so far as to say evangelical Christianity is abusive as a system. And you, even if it's unintended, are most likely experiencing harm in that system. So, and I also want to point out here at the end that this is not a beat up the men. The men have to give everything up. I've had to have my own reckoning for how I raised my children, right? This hurts so many areas of our lives, these hierarchies. And we all, when we're part of those systems, can become abusive in ways that we're not intending to and have done harm to people. So I just want to point that out. Like, I'm not putting this all on Dom or men. Like, we women, took part in it too and have things that we have to own now and work towards reconciling. So for my final statement, this is the conclusion that I've come to. Again, I'm not telling anyone right or wrong. You can totally just make different decisions and come to different sexual ethic than I have. I'm just sharing my view. But I do personally think the cure for purity culture is consent. It is not a new rules-based sexual ethic. What we need, I believe, is a connected communication where partners set and respect clear boundaries. And these boundaries should be able to be renegotiated over time because we grow as people. And as long as we have clear and open, ongoing communication and consent, it's all going to be okay. So I thank you all for listening to my story. I really hope you might have learned something helpful or feel validated in some way. And I hope that you all will have a chance to tell your own stories someday too, because I know we all have one. So thank you for listening.